First of all, thank you very much for this invitation to talk more about our paper, Order from Chaos, a meta-analysis of supply chain complexity and firm performance. This is a joint research by me, Robert Suurmond, Davide, Luzzini, and then Krause. And maybe I can indeed talk about how this project started. Well, first of all, it started as a structured literature review. Initially, it was me and Davide working on this paper. But then we realized that actually this is turning more into a full-fledged meta-analysis because we wanted to quantitatively synthesize previous research findings. So once we were working on another paper and then we find ourselves actually working on this. So I knew as a former colleague that Robert was the method expert in meta-analysis. And Davide, of course, suggested Dan Krause, who is really an expert on complexity. So you might be familiar with this famous 2006 conceptual paper of supply-based complexity of Choi and Krause. So that's how we formed this research group. And all of us were really excited about this research because we thought it was really timely and relevant. And I think the COVID-19 pandemic has proved us correct that supply chains are getting increasingly complex. There's no denial in that. So everybody is talking about supply chain complexity. And everybody thinks that it is becoming one of the most pressing issues. So there's a lot of research also going on that area too. There are a lot of reasons for why supply chains are getting complex. But obviously, we are living in a much more global world nowadays. And there's a lot of connections between the firms in the supply chain. And these are global connections that can be disrupted by many different reasons. There's also on the demand side much more variety, right? Customers are demanding more products with different functions, and all of this is resulting in extended product lines for the firms. So trying to meet this increasing customer demand and add to that also the increased volatility and uncertainty in supply markets, in customer markets. This is all becoming a lot more complex than companies are usually accustomed to. So many supply chain managers and purchasing managers are convinced that supply chain complexity is important, but we realized, despite the increasing research in that area, that our understanding of supply chain complexity and its performance effects is limited in two aspects. First of all, there's still a need for a clear conceptualization of supply chain complexity. There are different views on how to define complexity and what the dimensions and subdimensions are. And second, we have mixed findings. We have inconclusive findings. Although it seems that the majority of research finds a negative effect of supply chain complexity, right? We think that complexity is bad, that it's detrimental for performance. There are also opposing findings. Some studies find even a positive effect, some find no effect. This leaves researchers and practitioners also perplexed as to what to do with complexity, right? How can you manage complexity if you do not know yet the performance effects? This was actually the starting point for our research. We wanted to focus on these inconclusive findings and also shed light on these inconclusive findings by quantitatively synthesizing the extant empirical research on that topic. So what we did to answer this apparently simple question, right? What is the impact of supply chain complexity on performance? To investigate that, we realized that we should not treat supply chain complexity just as an aggregate concept, but also investigate its subdimensions. For that purpose, we distinguish between two elements. First of all, the level of supply chain complexity. So where we see complexity in the chain, is it upstream with the suppliers, downstream with the customers, or internally to the focal company? So in this research, we use the focal firm as the unit of analysis and then investigate complexity that might stem from internally from the firm or from its suppliers and customers. We also distinguish between the type of supply chain complexity, detail versus dynamic complexity. I do not want to go into details of that, but in table 1 of our research, basically we provide clear conceptualizations for each of these dimensions. I should also not forget to say that we distinguish between performance criteria. So we distinguish 3 performance outcomes: operational performance, innovation performance, and financial performance. Because as I mentioned, research illustrates varying effects. For instance, although the majority predicts a negative effect for operational performance, there are also studies finding that it might have a positive effect on innovation performance. So basically, this is in a nutshell the model that we have in our paper. And to investigate our research question, we did a database search and conducted a meta-analysis, which I think Robert will elaborate a bit more in detail.
So in terms of the actual research we conducted, we started to identify articles to be included in our review via 2 main approaches. So first, we used a keyword-based search. I think it's very common in meta-analysis in one of the major databases. And that already led to quite overwhelming, more than 5,000 hits, which Melek and Davide scanned and had to go through and filter to see which papers actually talk about complexity in the supply chain. We also went to search in a second step, manually searching 10 leading operations and supply chain management journals, because we noticed that complexity itself is often not a core construct of several articles. So we also wanted to make sure that we identify from the core set of literature those articles that treat complexity, for instance, as a control variable, and wouldn't want to ignore those. So after this initial identification of potentially relevant articles, we filtered based on the text in the abstracts, and subsequently also filtered and coded the entire remaining set based on the full text of those articles. So we ended up with a database including 123 empirical studies that represent 102 independent samples with over 27,000 observations. And I think figure 2 in the paper illustrates that search process in detail. Now, from these studies, we have taken the correlation coefficients for dimensions of supply chain complexity and performance, as Melek just mentioned, a 3x3 matrix, effectively. In combination with the sample size for these observations, we can then use what is called a random effects meta-analysis to compute the average effect for each of these relationships. And we needed to use some advanced meta-analysis techniques to account for dependencies between multiple effect sizes originating from the same sample or from the same study. So we constructed a multi-level model using random effects at the level of the effect and at the sample, and an error term for the average effect as well. And that leads to the main results of the paper that are summarized in table 3. We then went beyond and also conducted several additional analyses, for example, to examine whether the effect of complexity on performance varies with culture. And we do that for several other moderators as well, including industry and also construct definitions. So we use meta regression to explore the influence of these types of moderators, and that is summarized in table 4. So the key finding in our study is that, in contrast to the commonly held belief, supply chain complexity is not always detrimental. So our results suggest that although supply chain complexity negatively affects operational performance, it has a positive impact on innovation performance, and this is not what we expected, also a positive impact on financial performance. So first, complexity, and in particular upstream complexity, so stemming from suppliers, is negatively related to operational performance. And we find that in particular having many suppliers is costly and can influence quality as well. So it seems that external sources of complexity have more influence than internal complexity. So companies can manage their own complex operations better, potentially due to better oversight, than others' operations distributed around the globe. So complexity increases the operational burdens and makes it more difficult to plan and manage. However, in contrast to operational performance, we find that supply chain complexity has a positive impact on innovation performance, mostly through downstream complexity. And that aligns with the knowledge-based view, which suggests that access to a large number of varied knowledge resources increases the likelihood of generating positive innovation outputs. And so a large and varied and dynamic customer base can actually be a source of innovation for the firm. For instance, by soliciting a diverse set of customer inputs in an MPD project, or by promoting to address the needs of a diverse set of customers. So what we didn't expect to find is that supply chain complexity also has a positive effect overall on financial performance. And that mostly comes from internal complexity. And this is a quite interesting finding, at least to us, because financial performance is affected by both operational performance and innovation performance. So while supply chain complexity can pose operational challenges and hence increase costs and financial gains, such as the ones accrued from increased innovation, that may actually offset these negative effects. And our results seem to support this view. So all in all, our findings have two important theoretical and managerial implications. So first, we illustrate that supply chain complexity is not always detrimental. And second, we caution against treating supply chain complexity as a simple, uniform variable, as we also observe some nuanced finding across dimensions of complexity and performance. So managing complexity requires increased cross-functional decision-making and planning. And if managers focus too much on reducing complexity, for example, through supply-based reduction, they risk hurting their longer-term innovation prospects and financial performance. So there's not necessarily one optimal level of complexity, but it requires managers to trade off the opposite effects on different aspects of their firm's performance. And that means that different functions in the firm, operations, supply chain, marketing, finance, they need to collaborate to assess and manage supply chain complexity across the boundaries of their firm.
Where do we go from here, right? Now that we have this research, what can we suggest in terms of future research? Well, in the last part of our paper, we do provide a detailed research agenda for future research. Without going into too much detail of that, at least I would like to highlight some areas. But obviously, because this is a meta-analysis and we are investigating different combinations of supply chain complexity and performance dimensions, we were able to identify some under-researched areas, some under-researched relationships. We couldn't do a meta-analysis here because there were a limited number of studies. It was also interesting to note that there's very little research investigating the impact of supply chain complexity on more, strategic performance outcomes like sustainability performance or resilience capabilities, which are quite relevant as we can see nowadays. So there's also a need for more research in that area. Apart from these under-investigated research areas, we also kind of illustrate, because of the heterogeneity of our results, nuanced findings across dimensions and performance outcomes, it became evident that companies actually have different ways of managing complexity, but there's also limited research in that area. With the meta-analysis, obviously, we are able to illustrate an effect and the direction of that effect, but we cannot illustrate the mechanisms for that effect. So we don't know why supply chain complexity has a negative effect on operational performance, but a positive effect on performance. So there's more research for understanding how companies manage complexity and how complexity actually exerts its effects on performance. What are the mechanisms for that? What is the underlying rationale for that? And Robert has clearly mentioned that we also check for some contingencies, and we did identify some intriguing findings, for instance, related to national culture. And there might also be issues regarding the product that is offered. Actually, Robert has a nice illustration for that. Maybe Robert would like to talk more on that.
Sure, thanks, Melek. So one of the things that I realized when we were doing this research, and also in talking with managers in the field as well, is that we observed that some industries might have more complexity than others on average. That's also what we find in our research. But at the same time, companies themselves also take actions that differ from other companies, even within the same industry. So one of those examples is obviously Tesla in the automotive industry. So Tesla is highly vertically integrated. It has far fewer suppliers and also fewer downstream retail channels than major automotive players. So our research would then suggest that Tesla will have better operational performance, ceteris paribus, all else equal, but will not benefit from the complexity of their supply chain when it comes to innovation and financial performance. And now no one will, of course, claim that Tesla is not innovative, but it does largely stem from their own internal innovation units and R&D. And so firms like Toyota and maybe increasingly Volkswagen as well, they use and can use their external partners much more to actually drive innovation forward, and also new product development. In the electrical vehicle sector, we see this a lot. So our research highlights that complexity is not always detrimental, but it hurts operational performance in some cases. And so we need more and better theory to actually explain how this takes place. So how can we construct a theory of supply chain complexity that accounts for these patterns that we see in the supply chains all over the world? So our meta-analysis is hopefully a first step to clarify the multidimensionality of the phenomenon and the direct effects on different performance aspects as well. But our and others' future research will also be needed to drive this forward and also explore the mechanism better and more.